I'm Susan Joseph. I'm moderating this session. I'm an advisor to OWI. My prior experience was I ran ID 2020 last year. I currently consult in blockchain for financial services and insurance. I also sit on a few working groups for identity. And I'm pretty passionate. My background is I'm a lawyer and a business person. And I would say that my focus in my professional life has always been on the provenance of data, one way or another. And so the topic of voting biometrics identity all fits within that framework. But this is not about me, and I really like interactive sessions. So I'm going to task you guys to ask questions back and forth. I like something that goes Socratic, and I think we'll all get something out of it. So I'm going to turn this over to each person, let you each say a couple of things about what you're doing so you know who the panel is. We have the EU, US, and emerging markets represented. And go right ahead and do an intro. We have 45 minutes to have some fun, so let's have some fun.
Thank you, Susan. My name is Ivan Nabalon. I'm founder and CEO of Civitana, which is a network for citizen participants in Europe. Our motto there is a network, a B2C network with legal support, because we are dealing with identification, electronic signature, electronic voting, and so on. But also I'm CEO of Electronic ID, which is a technology identify people behind devices in internet by video in an easy way, and also do biometrics in order to voter registration.
Good morning. Thank you, Susan. So my name is Pete Martin. I'm the founder and chief bottle washer for a company called Votem, and we have an online platform for voting for both private and public elections. On the front end, we use both mobile and just normal desktop online. On the back end, we use blockchain for voting, and to the best of my knowledge, we've done more votes on blockchain than any other company in the world. We've got about 3 million votes right now for both public and private elections. And so we could talk about kind of how we do identity in the US and Canada and how we're trying to do it around the world.
Hi, I'm Niall McCann. I'm the UN Development Programme's lead electoral advisor. So in that function, I advise all of the UNDP country offices around the world that are assisting national governments to host or to organise their own elections in response to a national request from those governments. That can be anything from 30 to 50 countries a year ask for some assistance with organising their own elections. That can be anything from organising a 3-day workshop to talk about reform of the electoral legal framework in that country, right the way up to a $200 million project in a country like Afghanistan, literally helping to register voters, organise voting, organise results transmission.
Okay, great. So now you know who your experts are. I want to poll the audience. I want to have a sense of if you've considered the idea of pairing a biometric with an ID for voting. And I know different countries, people in different countries have different opinions. So who is here, first of all, who's in favor of it? Who's had experience with it? Interesting. So all of you who are in favor of it have not had experience with it. Nobody here has had experience with it. We're obviously in the U.S. having some issues, if you look at the headlines, with the concept of voter fraud. And clearly a biometric might aid in that. I'd like the opinion of the EU, US, and emerging markets on that, and your experience with a biometric if you've had one. Particularly, I'd like to know what you think your population thinks, because certainly in the US, we have a view about what biometrics mean when they tag to an identity and a government knows it. In the emerging markets, that is sometimes exactly how you get registered to be a citizen, is with a biometric, and so it's already de facto, so it's not necessarily something you're going to have an opinion on, because it's that or nothing. So let's have a discussion about starting with that. And if you have questions in this, stand up and ask. I do want it interactive.
Well, I can start. No, all I can say is we are working on any other industries, I mean with the video identification, with the remote identification and biometrics, we are working in any other industries like finance sector who requires a high level of security. And it's very objective to say that with these mechanisms, we have more security than in the face-to-face identification. We were chatting before. Some people, both here in the US, I don't know the state, just singing and comparing the signature in one paper. So if we compare these two processes, I think the electronic one is more secure and is more accurate than any other.
So in the U.S. and in Canada, to a large degree, and specifically in the U.S., very few people don't know this, but in our Constitution, it basically says that the rules around voting in terms of running elections, paying for elections, and everything else happens at the state level. And so the challenge we have in terms of implementing things like biometrics for voter identification and authentication is that the rules across all 50 states vary as it relates to showing up at a polling place, filling out an absentee ballot, or whatever, to go cast your vote and to identify yourself as a registered voter. And in most of the states, truthfully, if you show up and you're breathing, you can vote. And when you talk about things like just any kind of a biometric, what ends up happening is becomes a political conversation. And if you track elections and all the issues and challenges around voter ID laws, what typically happens is that one party will say, hey, voter ID, just having a photo ID, whether it's a driver's license, a passport, a state ID, food stamp card, anything, that should, you should have at least some form of identification to prove that you are who you are. And so it turns into a disenfranchisement conversation about people that don't have IDs of any sort, and our constitutional right is you get to vote. So some of the work we've done around biometrics for voter identification kind of flies in the face of the legislation and the jurisdictions that we have to work with, unfortunately. And so although we think it's a great idea and it's a better way of authenticating voters, it's just very difficult legislatively. On top of that, what we found is very interesting is that people will, for instance, give their fingerprint to Apple to unlock their phone, but when you put the use case of voting on top of it in the US, people freak out. They wonder because it's a government thing, and so they wonder what you're doing with their fingerprint, right? And so some of the testing we've done around facial scans and facial recognition and fingerprint ID is the use case of voting changes the psychology and the behavior of an individual. Even some of the stuff we've done around facial recognition or even a retinal scan, people then assume that when you do that just to authenticate themselves and then they actually go cast the ballot, that we know now how you actually voted because we took your picture, right? And it's just the psychology of people. So it's really very challenging from a human psychology, cultural, and legislative perspective.
We've assisted about 15 countries around the world at this point to design, procure, implement, roll out biometric voter registration systems. I have to say we don't do it with any great enthusiasm. And every 2 years, the Secretary General of the UN issues a report to the General Assembly documenting the UN's work in support of democratic elections over the previous 2 years. And in the last two reports in 2015, 2013, he's actually expressed some concern about the use of what we call expensive high technology being deployed in electoral systems that may not be the most sustainable going forward. And I think some of the concerns that we have relate to a couple of fundamental questions. What exactly is the problem that you're trying to solve? Has there been in that country any previous documented evidence of voter fraud? If there hasn't, then what problem are you trying to fix by introducing biometric technology? That's one question, because when you see systems being deployed for tens of millions of dollars in countries, to be very, very honest with you, where the level of GDP is extremely low, or where public budgets are extremely low, and you see the amount of money vis-a-vis the amount of money spent on education and health and welfare being deployed on this type of high technology systems, you have to ask questions about cost-benefit analysis. Now, we've seen countries that have made this decision. We're going to have biometric voter registration. We don't necessarily have had any problems in the past with voter fraud, but we're going to roll that out. That will involve doing a mass registration exercise all over the country. That country may not have, in our experience, may not have electricity in all of the villages that's able to power these machines. It may not have thousands of computer literate staff that literally know how to work these kits. It may not have mobile phone technology that allows somebody get on the phone to a technical support guy 100 miles away and say, why have I a blue screen? What do I do now? This has all happened in many of the countries that we've worked in. Also, because thumbprint has been the default biometric that has been gathered, we've seen pretty alarming rates on failure to enroll. Up to 30% in a lot of contexts, where either due to the fact that someone literally doesn't have a fingerprint that's able to be measured anymore, or due to poor training of the staff, they simply haven't captured the biometric. If you haven't captured the biometric, then there was no point installing biometric technology in the first place. Now, this sounds very negative, and it shouldn't be, because the reality is also in a lot of contexts, the introduction of biometric technology has detected multiple registrants, has detected, in many cases, people deliberately trying to cheat the system, or political parties that have instructed their voters to try and pack voter registers with their own supporters so that they go win elections. And the biometric technology has brought a level of public confidence to the system by somehow guaranteeing the authenticity of the process. But overall, what we do advise countries these days is do a proper feasibility study, do a proper cost-benefit analysis before you make this decision. Because also, by the way, you're likely to end up with a foreign technology company in a lot of these countries that's going to implement this system. That may be fine, but also it may not be fine. If you're contracting, for example, a company from a country that has a very, very sensitive or delicate political relationship with the host country, that can create its own challenges. And we've seen cases, for example, where a foreign technology company, to do the deduplication process, has decided to outsource that to another company on the other side of the world. And that politically got out in the public. And so people in this West African country were going, why the hell are people sitting in a warehouse on the other side of the world in Asia making a decision about who gets to vote because a computer program has thrown up a potential biometric match on this? That isn't a process that should be outsourced to some, a supply company the other side of the world. That's a process that should be made politically, internally, within the borders of our own country. And it should be a human being of the Electoral Commission that decides ultimately who gets to be on the voter register and who doesn't. I think I'll stop.
Yep. Okay. So I'm curious to know, if you're in an ideal world, if you were to attach your ideal biometrics to this, how would that work? How would it work? Or is there another? We're all presuming that biometrics is the next gen. We have a question? Okay, John.
Come here.
Yep.
John Sharma, chair of EMA. A couple of things. First, a clarification: we're talking about e-voting and not internet voting, right?
No, we haven't made that distinction
right.
yet,
So
and that's something to talk about.
Those are different and have different capabilities.
Correct.
Second thing, biometrics. Biometric technology for enrollment is great for smaller countries, or for a large number of countries, should I say, because they're very hardware intensive and they're capital intensive. And that has opportunities for the government, which is why you want to have as many elections and stuff as possible, because every time is another round of skimming of the capital expenditure. So there's a real reason for doing that, or not, as the case may be. The third thing is, when we're talking about biometrics, I would imagine that there would be a real worry about any contact biometric, let's say fingerprint, which is contact, which is cheaper than non-contact biometrics, but potentially you might still contact. Because in West Africa at the moment, I think if I was West African, I would be really scared about using contact biometrics in any way, shape or form because of cross-infection. I suspect that eventually that form of biometrics will be shunned because of that particular issue. It really is, and no matter how you clean it, it really is a major way of cross-infection.
Okay, so
have you found that? Sorry, my question is: have you found that attitude?
Well, I want to go first. I want to get to that, but first, let's frame it. So let's frame it between mobile and web, because there is quite a difference in that. So in the developing countries, we're seeing mobile, correct? Largely.
How do you mean by mobile?
Remote phone, or
Not
is this
at all.
It's not. Okay, so is anybody doing?
Susan, sorry, I meant actually turning up to a voting station or doing it by phone remotely.
Right, right.
remotely or actually in a polling place, and it's and as opposed to a paper ballot, it's an electronic ballot.
Right. So do you have any of you had experience doing phone remote voting?
Yeah. No, go ahead. Well,
Okay, and I'll speak.
we were chatting before, and we have an alliance with the world-leading electronic voting company, which is Untitled, based in Spain. And we have the first projects doing an end-to-end project remotely. I not totally agree what the biometrics is quite expensive because we don't need hardware anymore. We can do it and perform this biometrics and identification in our own device. So we can perform end-to-end electronic voting digitally. From the mobile phone or from the web, and securely too. So we have already some exercise and some projects doing that. And it's a good news because the security they have been a very solvent and security project. And let's see and let's be on the future, but we can do that already.
So kind of, sort of. So in DC, so we run the elections for military and overseas voters for DC and the state of Montana and Detroit. And so you can vote on your phone in all three of those jurisdictions. What actually happens in the back end is your vote never goes all the way through being tabulated and tallied. It goes to basically a manual procedure on the back end where they essentially take your ballot, print it off through the county. There's a Republican, a Democrat, and a third party. Then they literally recreate the ballot and run it through the normal tabulating process. From the voter's perspective, they voted online or on their phone. Okay. And so we've got hundreds of emails from people that are on a ship in the Mediterranean saying, I was never able to vote before. I'm so glad I could do this. This is phenomenal. They don't know that it's being processed manually in the back end. And in the States right now, you cannot you cannot tabulate any votes to any connected network. So you can collect votes online or mobile. You cannot tabulate them online. It's got to be an offline process. And I don't see that, frankly, changing in the near term. So
Let me just add, everything I said previously related to voter registration and not elections per se. At the moment, Estonia is the only country in the world that has internet voting for national elections, for national level elections. And so therefore the UN we have not helped Estonia. UN has no experience of helping countries do
actually,
any
New
form.
South Wales did.
That's not a national election, though. That's not a country.
That's true. Right.
So we don't have an experience on that at the moment. But I think we all, for those of you that are familiar with Estonia, so much of life is online in Estonia. And it's so homogenous a country with such absolute public trust in the digital online system that it seemed to them perfectly natural to move towards internet voting and ultimately voting on their mobile phone, which the majority of people that vote online, which is 31% in the last elections, have done. We would never, to be honest with you, in a context where there is very, very conflict-ridden elections in a country, in a developing country that has serious problems with voter registration, we would never recommend. I think the solution to this is that you need to have open up the opportunities for online voting or internet voting. That's just not going to happen, because ultimately the position of the UN is technology can improve an electoral process and can build upon pre-existing public confidence in the process. But technology does not bring public confidence in the process. If people want to systematically cheat on elections, they're going to cheat on elections. And whether they stuff paper ballots in a box or push a button on a screen 200 times, it's going to happen. So technology is not going to fix that, and that's our opinion on this.
Can I ask Niall a question? Yep. So in the cases where you implemented biometrics in a lot of the African countries, which is, I think, predominantly where they're doing it, have you seen any increase in the confidence from the citizens in the voting electoral process?
Yes, without question. Now, would that confidence have improved anyway without the introduction of this technology? That's a different question. That's the counterfactual thing. That's when we talk about actual cost-benefit analysis. Can we, is the rise in public confidence something that was going to happen anyway due to an improved electoral law, due to improved professionalism of the electoral administration, due to agreements among political parties to sign up in advance to codes of conduct, to allow public scrutiny, to allow an increase in the number of observers, to allow party agents to be present in all polling stations. There's many public confidence enhancing measures that can be introduced in elections. Technology is one of them, without question.
Okay, John, ask your question again.
Right, sorry about the.
Can you go to the mic?
Oh.
Mike?
So, okay, the final bit was, have you seen any pushback at all in West Africa, for example, from the fear of cross-infection using biometrics?
No.
Why not?
No.
I'm just curious.
It's a very good question, John. I don't know. And everywhere, I don't know. Certainly in terms of international assistance to elections from the UN, or indeed from groups based in Washington like IFAS with the support of the United States government, I don't know of any country that has used a biometric other than digital thumbprints to register voters or to verify voters on election day. Now, should we have? And moving forward, should we move to a new biometric? Quite possibly, yes. I mean, from what I hear in terms of the industry developments, thumbprints are on the way out anyway within the next couple of years, and it's all going to move to iris and facial recognition, i.e. contactless biometrics. But as we're all probably aware, taking iris scans, etc., in outdoor conditions, in heavy sunshine, in villages, in remote, presents a major problem. So you have to look at then other equipment in terms of the type of equipment that's been used in the ADAR program, etc., which of course increases the cost.
And not only that, I spent a couple weeks in Kenya, and the people of the Maasai origin don't want their picture taken. And so you're not going to culturally have that ability to be able to do that, more than likely.
Very good point.
Let's get the Western view of what a visual scan is and what the increased biometrics might be. Use your imagination, I mean, on what you see is coming.
Well, another thing is, and it's a question for you, you do the enrollment by the biometrics, but also after that you have to go to the place, to the school or whatever, to vote. And I think the benefit of that is not very much to me. It doesn't give me some benefit in a short time. You do something electronic, spend a lot of money, but you need to go presentially to the school. And that, to me, has to change. So let's vision the future. The electronics is looking for the future, looking for probably change the democracy paradigm, not vote every 4 years, but also to become something more systematic and do it remotely, end-to-end. So I don't see the benefit, to be honest, to spend a lot of money to get the biometrics, the fingerprints, the face, and go after that, go to the school to perform the vote. What do you think about that?
There's 2 points there, Ivan. A very good point. Firstly, as well, on the issue of photographs, obviously we know of countries, particularly in the Middle East, where not only photographing women is just not acceptable, even for women to photograph women is not acceptable within polling stations or registration centres where that takes place, because there have been cases where then literally people have said, aha, but those photographs are going to go back to a data centre in the capital city, and men in those working in those data centres are going to see those photographs. It's not acceptable. So what do you do then? So are we going to, for the countries that are using biometrics, are they going to have to stick to thumbprints for females but move to iris and face for men? I just don't think that's realistic. But on Ivan's point, this is good. I mean, I do think it is inevitable for a lot of countries that are eventually going to move to both remote registration and remote voting. I'd love to be able to register to vote online and to be able to vote online. But I do think in the developing world that's some way off. And when you have, again, political challenges around the credibility of an election, where even organised, controlled voting in a polling station is incredibly suspicious to a lot of political parties. Taking that outside of a controlled environment and now introducing remote, offline or online voting in remote, uncontrolled circumstances, where people will probably believe in a lot of contested elections that people have got guns to people's heads telling them how to vote, then that's going to be a major challenge, yes.
So, given the population age change that we see, kind of a sea change, right? We're all looking at millennials taking over a good percentage of the population, being very free with information coming out, not having so far in where they are in life, not having embraced the same privacy concerns that an older generation might have, and wanting to do everything conveniently on their phone, one-stop place. We see a lot of disruption happening in financial services and other parts of the economies. So I know, Pete, you said you are not confident about mobile voting coming to the United States. And certainly in the EU as well as a similar developed population. But given the sea change of this new generation coming up, how do you think that plays into this?
The minute that major politicians lose an election because they didn't address millennial issues is the day that that tide will turn. So millennials right now demographically are the largest demographic population in the U.S. by numbers, 85, 90 million millennials, but most of them don't vote today, right? So they get ignored to a large degree by campaigns. And so I think the time when a politician loses because they didn't reach and talk about the issues of millennials, like they want to vote on their phone. We've done tons and tons of surveys, and potentially there could be a 9 to 10% uplift in voter turnout if they could vote on their phones. That's great theory. Who knows? Kind of the cause and effect about biometrics, right? Who knows whether that's why they vote or not, or whether they care about the issues. But I think when they start either, people are losing elections because this is not something they're able to do, or they start making the laws because they are elected, that's when it's going to change dramatically. I think most people in the elections industry in the U.S. will tell you it is not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. And then that's when the debate starts. And some will tell you it's 20 years from now, and some will tell you it's 2 years from now. It's somewhere in between that number. Who knows? So it's going to happen. But again, all 50 states have their own sets of laws. And in many cases, even counties have their own laws for the elections that they run. So it's going to happen, but I think there needs to be some proof points. I think there's something very interesting right now going on in India that could drive change faster around the world. And that is they are pushing for, mobile identity, right? And everything delivered through a mobile phone, including payments. And last month, mobile payments in India surpassed the amount of payments through credit cards. And so you've got this country that has this massive scale, bigger than anywhere in the world except China, right? That is getting rid of hard currency, that is delivering all government services via mobile phones, and payments are mobile phones. And so the next step is elections. And so they're already doing electronic voting machines today, and they do it very interestingly. So instead of being a pure software-based solution, they actually put the entire elections management system into ballot on a chip on electronic voting machines that they can take out on boats and horses and donkeys out to remote villages and collect votes and tally them. And they can deliver an election in a pretty short period of time for the size of country and the amount of people that India has. So I'd say we're going to watch this space and see how that kind of evolves, because at that scale, if they can prove that this is successful, I think a lot of countries are going to follow them.
And I'll get to you, but the follow on to that is, so what's the role of the biometric then as it rolls out? Because as mobile would become the vehicle, you need some way to make sure that there's no fraud and it's secure.
And that's what they're doing today. It's all 5 fingers, I believe, or something. Another interesting thing too, when you get into biometric identity, is governments generally are not very good at securing systems, right? We got hack after hack, for the federal government here. The Philippines did biometric enrollment for their last election. Their system got hacked, right? So it's one thing to get somebody's name, maybe social security number, and any other identifying information. It's a whole nother thing to get somebody's fingerprint, right? Now, it was supposedly incredibly well encrypted and hashed and everything else, and nobody's quite sure whether they actually got any identifying information or not. But that's pretty scary stuff when you can collect somebody's fingerprint. And so I think part of the responsibility for vendors and for governments is going to be, when you do biometric enrollment, is they've got to secure this beyond anything that they've ever done before.
Aren't they just enrolling like a template? Like they're taking like the picture of the fingerprint and losing that? Like, I mean, one of the things I understand is like how the biometric system works and what it does actually really matters. And it can look the same to the consumer. What's going on in the back end is different. The amusement parks that are getting people to enroll their biometrics to go to the amusement park are mapping it to 250 templates and saying whether when you present you match to the template or not. They're not storing your fingerprint. They're dividing the human universe into 250 versions of a fingerprint and just seeing if you match it, which is kind of harmless, but helps them control their access for their season passes. So, anyways, like, we need to be really specific. That's one of the challenges within this industry, right? We can talk about the generics, but the specifics really matter. Because one's like an evil biometric system and one's kind of fine.
Well, but we're in a political environment, right? And so both parties will use it as a weapon or, whatever politically. And so, and you can't explain to the common consumer what's going on in the back end. They don't know, they don't care. But I completely agree with you. It does absolutely matter.
Yeah, I was going to say, just to add on to this, right, I think here in this setting, right, with professionals, it starts with us in making sure that we're really clear about what things mean. Because buying into the hyperbole that someone has just stolen your fingerprint is not helping at all, right? The thing that has been taken in any of these contexts isn't something that would allow someone with a 3D printer to reconstruct my fingerprint and pretend to be me like a James Bond movie, right? So we have to be really, really careful about talking and not buying into the hype of that. So I just a caution for us. If we're not going to do it, who is?
Sorry, risk of asking too many questions. I think we really should be looking at this in multi-stages. In each country will have different situation. Whether or not we should start off with voting, national voting, or we go for consultation to start off with remote. E-consultation is a big part of e-democracy, and in Europe is now starting to take off. They're talking about anonymized, qualified anonymity is something which is quite interesting for the EU at the moment. And consultation is one thing. When you go into national voting, I think national voting is also a social expression of democracy. And you may find, especially in the third world, in developing countries, it's an expression of, hey, I can vote. Now, I may be coerced a bit, and that's down to management at the polling station and confidentiality at that point. But it's going to the voting station for a national election is an expression of democracy and demonstrates, the government is demonstrating that it is in some way, shape or form, is listening somehow or other to the people as opposed to a mobile phone where you do and you don't know and it could go into a bucket of black goo at the other end. So,
well, I have an opposing point of view in that from two perspectives. The one is, one of the things that's happening over here is you've got two constituencies that either physically can't get to a polling place, right, for either a physical disability, mental disability, or they're overseas and in the military. So what happens right now is the rules for military and overseas voters are slightly different than everybody else, okay? Like Montana and DC, you can vote online. Same thing with the National Federation for the Blind has been suing a few select states, California, Ohio, Maryland, and they're winning because most of the laws around voter registration, absentee balloting, whatever it is, are not ADA compliant, and they're winning. And so you've got, let's call it 10 to 15% of the population of the U.S., the rules apply a little bit differently. And so what's happening now legislatively in some of the state houses is that they're looking at some of these rules around voter authentication, voter identification, the actual process of voting, and having to physically go to a polling place. And I get it from a social democratic perspective that it's an honor and it's a responsibility to walk to the polling place and vote, right? But a lot of people just can't simply do that. Or if you're working two jobs, you can't get there. And I think that's kind of happening around the world too. And so I think that there are some cultural things too that maybe we're going to separate ourselves from what was a tradition, right, to maybe move into a little bit new world.
So why don't we just replicate what we have at the moment, which is you can physically go or you can have a postal vote and have multi-channel democracy?
That's what we're trying to push. Absolutely. Just like, banking or a store, right? If you only can go to a store, probably not going to keep going to that store. If you can go online and to a store, buy something online, take it back to store. This is what we're getting used to, right? And so we can't separate the way we now operate in the real world from the way we're going to operate in a democratic world. It's kind of the same thing. So you're right. It should be omni-channel voting. And I, as a citizen, should be able to vote however I want to vote, right?
Well, that's what's happening in Estonia, where you have 70%
That's right.
voting regularly and 30% by mobile. Is it mobile or online?
It's
Either.
yeah, it's both.
Okay.
But the majority in the last election chose their phone rather than their laptop or
Yeah.
desktop computer.
Well, that's only possible because they have some split keys on the phone.
Well, they also have a national ID.
Yeah.
With a card, with a chip.
You're ready? I don't.
They do, you're right. I'm actually
Big difference.
Estonian citizen, so I have not voted.
Well, I was just curious about the role of blockchain, and wouldn't that have the ability now to reduce this problem of stored data and fraud that we're all worried about?
Absolutely. So one of the things that we're working on with our blockchain platform is giving independent authorities, trusted parties, the ability to validate the votes in real time. So we've talked to IFES and said, all right, here's our blockchain platform, and you can give a node to the Republicans, the Democrats, the Libertarians, the Green Party, and IFES, or an auditor, or some advocacy organization. So give a node to the ACLU, give the one to the NAACP, and they can validate every vote in real time. That's actually what we're doing with all the private elections we're doing. We'll give a node to the accounting firm, to the organization themselves, and to a third party. And every vote that goes in through the blockchain platform gets validated in real time. When consensus is reached across all these independent nodes, then and only then is the vote actually written to the ballot box permanently, right? And so the ability to then have a legitimate democratic election where you've got independent parties who don't trust each other from different political affiliations, and third-party observers like the UN or IFES that validate the vote in real time. There's no recount needed. Imagine in a company auditing every transaction that went through a company's books. That's exactly what we're doing, right? So yes, you're 100% on the mark.
I think we used to see the whole voting process in two parts. One is the identification and the authentication. I think blockchains it does nothing at the moment. And for the other part, for the integrity in the voting, I think so, we do. But let's say that the blockchains, from my perspective, in the first step, in the identification or authentication at the moment, there is not a blockchain technology just to solve that problem. So from my perspective, it's solving the integrity process of the voting, nothing else.
So and I'm glad you asked the blockchain question because I was going to ask it if you hadn't. I had a few conversations with some state officials recently, and there was a really visceral reaction to, one, remote voting, and two, biometrics. This is U.S. And I was counseled that the way to present this is not about access, but it's about anti-fraud. And that's where government might start to buy in. So as an industry, it's an interesting position to take because in anti-fraud, it doesn't become the same political issue as access does in their minds. And so you might be able to move things forward a little bit faster. So I'm curious about I was directly told this in several occasions. So I'm curious about your opinion.
So you mean about fraud in the process?
So, well, yes. So, there's a lot of conversation about is there fraud in the electoral process, which leads, of course, to is there access to vote. But if you talk about access to vote, it becomes a highly politicized, disenfranchised issue. And if you talk about fraud in an existing system, it's a little bit different because governments seem to be sensitive to not wanting to operate systems today that are riddled with fraud. That's what I was advised as how to position this. So I'm offering that up as a point of discussion.
Well, let's assume that the fraud is, we have fraud now in the offline processes, and we will have fraud in the biometrics processes and in the digital processes. So let's talk about the amount of fraud, because the security, 100%, we don't have that in offline and neither in online, from my perspective.
So President Trump signed an executive order last week to look into this fraud issue in the last year's elections.
It's different, though, to get funding and to move forward. So I'm talking on a purely like pragmatic.
So they're evaluating this fraud issue, right? And so fraud, it becomes this big topic. So what does fraud actually mean, right? And so if somebody throws a ballot box in the dumpster before it gets down to central tabulation, is that fraud? Yes. If somebody tries to vote twice, fraud? Yes. Is a squirrel that gets fried on an electric line in Maryland that shuts down the polling place for a day, is that fraud? I don't know, right? But what I do know is a bunch of votes didn't happen. 25,000 ballots from the Middle East that were shipped over by the military never made it here in time for the election. Is that fraud? I don't know, right? So fraud becomes this really big issue. I think what most secretaries of state will tell you is in the U.S., for the most part, there's no fraud. What happens is, if you run a company and you've got a contact database of your customers, that's always changing, right? It requires a lot of manual effort to keep it up to date. So you've got this very transient world in the U.S. where people are moving from state to state, city to city. They go to college, they come back, whatever. So there's lots of legislation and policies around purging voter rolls, right? If you haven't voted in 4 elections in most states, particularly with Republican secretaries of state, they will purge you from the voter roll because they assume you're dead, you're not in the state or whatever. Some people call that fraud, right? And a lot of states in Ohio, they just lost a case where they said you can't purge them from the rolls. You got to figure out emphatically whether or not, factually, that person is actually no longer a resident of the state. So fraud, I think, gets kind of segmented into somebody's trying to vote twice, but it's much, much bigger than that. And it's all about good or bad process in my mind.
I think we are in, knowing the way millennials and there is an inevitability, I believe, about an increase in the desire for people to be able to vote online outside of a controlled environment of a polling station. And I do agree with Yvonne here that it seems at this point almost archaic to introduce high technology, meaning electronic voting machines within polling stations. You're still making people come to the polling station. I'm not sure there's much of a benefit there over what was pre-existing. So there is an inevitability, I believe, about an increase in remote online voting. Does blockchain potentially have a role? Absolutely. Absolutely. There's no question. I think we have no experience of it. No country has asked yet. And I'll be very, very honest with you. Neither the United Nations or bilateral assistance providers like the United States government via groups like IFIS or NDI, I don't think are going to be the pioneers for innovation, advising a lot of countries saying, why don't you move to blockchain? To help? We're just not that innovative or risk-taking, frankly. There's always this sense that we can't be the ones that are blamed if a process goes wrong. Now, if a country says, we're going down this road, we have decided we're going down this road, will you help us do that? Then there's much more likely for a yes, but it's unlikely we'll be the ones to propose it.
Okay, we have time for a couple of questions and then,
So, and just another comment that's like sometime lost on outsiders coming here. One of the reasons they have electronic voting machines here is because people are voting for like 20 or 30 things, right? And it was completely baffling as a Canadian. My dad's like, why don't they just use like paper and a ballot, right? Like, when you vote in Canadian election, you vote for one thing. Like, who's your representative? Here, there's 20 things. So it's not even a good model to export, right? It's always, but when, the specifics matter, but it's okay to mention them.
No, it is true.
So I want to bring it back to blockchain for a second. We had recently a Secretary of Homeland Security declare that election systems are a piece of critical infrastructure, which brings with it a lot of designations, interaction with industry, things like that. So how do you see that balance going between we've now decided this is a piece of critical infrastructure. There's a tendency to want to put walls around it, a firewall, say, okay, the government must know every node, every nook and cranny of it, versus the notion of blockchain, which is it's not owned by anyone, it's distributed. How does that tension play out, whether in the states or broadly?
The states are very unhappy with that designation, and they are for two reasons. One is they had been working with JEB before that decision was made, and so it became as a surprise to them. There's an association of the state secretaries. They put together a letter, sent it back to Homeland Security, and just said, we think this is a really bad idea. And for two reasons. One is there's this perception of federal oversight to what is constitutionally a state process, right? Number one. Number two is a lot of them basically said, look, oversight without money is a bad thing, right? It's just more work. It's more overhead. So I think if the government came back and in 2003, they gave $3.2 billion to all the states to upgrade their voting machines. And so I think a lot of the secretaries said, hey, if you're going to give us a bunch of money, we'll give you a view into what's going on in our elections. But without money and just oversight, this is a really bad thing. And that's all being worked out right now. I don't know what's going to happen, but I think they have this perception of, TSA in every polling place, right? That's kind of the fear right now.
So another blockchain-related question. I guess my question is the world ready for political elections using what is still a new technology? I mean, we understand how SQL servers work. We understand how electricity works. We understand how paper works. Blockchain, I mean, what, 8, 10 years? And adding to that question, if we were thinking of blockchain or distributed ledgers as having utility for election, how would we iterate on that? I don't think you would just hand it over to New York State and say, election on the blockchain. Maybe you'd do something like using corporate governance as a model, building it out in the private sector. So I'd be interested in your thoughts on that. Are we ready for it? And if not, for state elections, how would you iterate and develop distributed ledger technology in such a way that you could use it for voting?
I talking for a European perspective. I think it's a matter of maturity. So if we look the countries, look the democracy systems, we see in the north the countries with major maturity. So it won't have problems. Countries like Norway or Switzerland, even they have some education maturity and some track record working in democracy. Probably they won't have problems to move to electronic voting, no matter blockchain, no matter any other technology. I think it's a matter of maturity, a matter of education. And probably we will go, everyone go to the electronic, but probably this kind of countries go first.
So blockchain voting is happening already. So Estonia's last election, the back end was done on blockchain, okay? National election. But your point is exactly what we're doing. So we're proving this out through private elections. I said we have 3 million votes on our blockchain platform to date. That's almost all, 95% of that is all private elections. And so we're going to continue to prove out the technology using private elections. But I can tell you, we're having conversations with governments at a federal level and at kind of a state, provincial, metropolitan level, municipal level, where in a lot of the states in the U.S., they can have a different process for a non-presidential or gubernatorial election than they do for those. And so we're talking to some pretty progressive cities and some counties about using this technology to run an election. And we've got some elections coming up next year and some special elections that you'll hear about probably in 6 months to a year where it was run on blockchain. Part of the challenge, particularly in the U.S., is by law today and all across all 50 states, you can't connect the tallying to any open network, right? And so we've had to take a network-based architecture and make it a disconnected offline architecture. It's really kind of a interesting, funny thing, but it's going to get proven out through some developing countries, some private elections, and some large counties and munis. And over time, I think it'll be more accepted. But you're right, definitely not today.
I think you can also look into see, although we haven't had blockchain other than Estonia outside of the U.S., but I think you can look to see what is happening there and use that to inform. So I was told that Brazil is looking at doing national elections on blockchain. So if you have a few successes that become very noted, I think that move, everybody wants to be the first mover. So I think it's a matter of time and education as it sort of floods the rest of the office processes as well, financial services, et cetera, as it becomes trusted and more of a name and not this weird animal that people don't know how to describe. And becomes actually relatively immaterial to the consumer using it, which is really where you want it to be. You don't want it, the interface, the person using it doesn't need to know what's behind it. They just need to know that they can do it with integrity. So I think we're not at that point, but as you see things powered that way, if the UN watches Brazil having a positive election, then maybe somebody coming in to help fund the UN on an election deal will bring in their technology, blockchain, to do some tests globally. So I see this as something that's mushrooming. I think it's time to just wrap up. And if there's any more comments, you guys can sit here. It's 10 of. So, but wrap up.
Make one point on
Yep.
this. There are so many countries around the world at the moment where there is two parties competing and it's win at all costs. And that means cheating either legally or illegally. And an example of legal cheating, for example, or I could say is almost cheating, would be where political party agents present in polling stations just object to everything that's taking place, to utterly question the credibility of the process in that polling station, with the hope that ultimately the results from that polling station are going to get thrown out somehow, not because there's anything necessarily bad going on, but because that polling station is in an area where it is known everyone in that village supports the other side. Now, is there the idea that both polling staff, accredited independent observers of the process from civil society, and representatives of political parties from both sides have the opportunity via blockchain technology to be able to verify the credibility of a ballot that is arriving from a remote location before that vote is actually opened to be counted? Has that the potential to build confidence? Absolutely. Without question, that has the ability to build confidence in the process. Again, don't underestimate, however, if those votes are arriving from locations that are known to support the other side, is there the possibility that political parties are going to contest it no matter what? No matter what. And if they have been empowered via a regulatory framework as a result of rolling out blockchain technology that actually gives the parties rights to contest, and if they see that a ballot hasn't arrived from a verifiable location, etc., then there is a possibility they're going to challenge no matter what. I wouldn't underestimate that. But is this a very interesting development, one that is absolutely going to roll out? I do believe so, yeah.
Okay, looks like the next panel is showing up. So thank you very much. And it's been a pleasure. Again, thanks for coming out this morning.